Good morning. Glad to see everyone here this morning as we're in the downward stretch on summer. And finally got a dry spell, at least where I'm at. I don't know if any of y'all have had a break from the rain, but I had some break from it. Before we get started, let's go to the Lord in prayer. Father, we thank you for this time to meditate and study your word, to discuss it and learn more. Open our hearts, Father, but also open our minds that we can see what you're trying to tell us. We look forward, Father, to learning all that you have to show us and learning more about you. In your Son's name, amen. Right before the lesson, I was going through looking on my Bible app and trying to determine which version would be best to talk about what we're going to talk about today. And so I may switch back versions on you periodically. Well, as you all know, we're in Ecclesiastes, and as you may have found out from those who've taught, from Jerry and Jim, sometimes interpreting what the teacher says, and in this case Solomon, can be confusing at times. Even the commentators that I consulted as part of this lesson say one thing, and then somebody else says another. In fact, our book commentator goes through, and I was reading that, and then I read some other commentators, and then I went back and read the passage myself, and I actually disagree with what our commentator says, not theologically, but the writer's interpretation of events, of what was trying to be said. So what we're going to talk about today, what may seem to take you one direction really could be pointing you in another direction. So it's going to be a lot up to what's your thought and what we discuss, and in just what you yourself believe and what God reveals to us. And we're going to talk about one of the two taboo subjects in church. We're going to talk about politics. Yes. Ooh. I don't know if I've told you this, but I have two people in my life. One was a very good friend whose husband was in the legislature, and she was very active when I was working with the airport system in legislative affairs. And she said one time, "Do you know what the definition of politics is?" I said, "I mean, you want the book answer or what?" She says, "Now, I tell you the truth." I said, "Politics is show business for ugly people." She said, "Politics is show business for ugly people." And so I went, okay. I kind of agreed with it in a way. And but then the other definition of politics that got my attention was, what was his name? He's a Jewish cowboy, ran for governor, and he spoke to us at one time. I'll remember his name. Anyway, he said, politics. He says, "What is politics?" "Well, let me tell you." He says, "We all know what poly means. That means many of. We have all heard that term, poly." And he says, "We're all from Texas, and we know what ticks are." So that's what he said. Politics is what he called it. But we'll talk a little bit. It won't be quite probably what you think, but we will talk a little bit about politics very, very briefly. Well, today we're in chapter 4, starting in verse 13. Now, this is the one I'm going to read out of the New Living Translation, only because it seems to make a little more sense to me than what I read out of Holman and NIV. Now, follow along, and we'll see and think about as we begin to talk what you heard or what you read and then what we talk about. So let's go ahead and get started, and we'll talk about some of these. Again, we're in Ecclesiastes 4, and we are starting in verse 13. Get down there. It is better to be a poor but wise youth than an old and foolish king who refuses all advice. Such a youth could rise from poverty and succeed. He might even become king, though he has been in prison. But then everyone rushes to the side of yet another youth who replaces him. Endless crowds stand around him. But then another generation grows up and rejects him too. So it is all meaningless, like chasing the wind. Now, you kind of go, kind of like I did, and I said, well, okay, what are we talking about here? I'll tell you what, let me ask you first what you think. And again, there's no wrong answer. And remember, this is Sunday school, not the early morning sermon. So I need you to participate. What, in general, what do you think that passage was talking about? Anyone? You're bound to have an opinion. Do I need to read it in Spanish or no? I'm joking. I'm sorry. You know, getting to the top is meaningless. Okay, exactly. That's a good interpretation. Anybody else? What do you think it was talking about? Listen to what other people are saying. Exactly. I mean, like I said, there is no wrong answer. Anything? Anybody else? Ma'am? Good. I mean, these are all good. Anybody else? These are all good and they're all correct. Where the difference where, and this is little minor stuff, and it's not even, in here they're talking, this guy said there were 3 characters in the story, and all the other commentators said there were only 2. That there was an old, foolish king who basically didn't listen to his advisors anymore. He went his own way and did his own thing. He didn't pay attention. But at one time, he had been a wise youth. And that was a little bit unusual to the Hebrew mind. Young and wise were not 2 words that went together. Neither was old and foolish. Old and wise usually went together, and young and foolish. Now, most of us in here, from looking around, have probably advanced a little beyond the term youth, but I won't say we're old. But in our experience, how many, do most of you agree that from our viewpoint, the young sometimes do act mostly foolishly? Anybody disagree with that? I won't say all the time, but I do see folly in young decisions. My granddaughters buy jeans that have more holes in them than the jeans I use to go outside and work in the yard. And yet they turn up their nose, and I said, well, you want to wear one of mine? And so I think that that's a foolish decision to buy clothes that already have holes pre-torn in them. Okay. So we mostly agree. And that's kind of how the Jewish mind worked as well, that the young had not had enough experience to be considered wise or to have understanding or to have learned enough. And all of us, I was that way, and my son was that way, and then I've got grandchildren that are this way. When they reach a certain age, usually around getting 13 and beyond, they are all of a sudden imbued with this tremendous wisdom from somewhere, and they now are capable of explaining to me or their parents what is really going on and what's really happening. That they have this special knowledge and insight that they have, that we don't understand what's going on, that we don't know what's been happening, that we just aren't in tune with anything. As one of my granddaughters says, when I'm watching movies and suggest things, she'll say sometimes, "Papa, can't we watch something from this century?" So, anyway, but I am reminded of a story. Now, some of you may have heard this about age and wisdom. Because one thing that comes with age, or should come with age, is learning and wisdom and understanding. Experience is what it's called. And what we're talking about here is a king who, as he got older, was either depending totally upon his own experience and wasn't listening to the experience of others, which experience should tell us that we should listen to others, get wise counsel. But he didn't. And I'll get to my story in a moment. He, as a youth, he did this, and he was even so that what they're trying to describe here is this individual, even if they came from prison, could rise to be a king and use his wisdom. But as they got older, didn't depend upon the counsel of others, thought that he knew more than anything, and became foolish, which is something this is the lesson we should learn, is not to become foolish as we get older, but continue to exercise our wisdom. But getting back to this other story then about exercising wisdom and where wisdom comes from. When I worked again with the airport system, and this would have been in the 90s, and Robert Lee still thinks I'm young, by the way. I said when I was younger, but Robert Lee said to some of the people in the congregation, I'm still a youngster. I think he was talking about me. But anyway, when I was younger at the airport system, we would have staff meetings usually on Monday morning, and the senior people would sit around and discuss the activities of the week, what we needed to do and what our goals were. There was a gentleman in there who was a senior engineer named Robert Grimes. Now, at this time, Robert was in his early 80s, and he would sit in on the staff meeting. And not all the time, but a lot of the time, we would look over, and Robert was sitting there in his desk, in his chair, like this. Robert was taking a nap Monday morning. We would be talking, and somebody would say, "Hey, Bob." And he'd go, "Yeah." And they'd say, "We were discussing," and then they would tell him what the question was. And Bob would sit there for a minute or two, or just a little bit, and then he would launch into an explanation and an answer, very detailed. And it amazed me. I'm thinking, this guy was asleep during most of the earlier discussion, yet we ask him, and he gives this perfectly logical, lucid answer, and we're going, And so one day I asked Bob, I said, "Bob, I know you've been around the airport a long time. In fact, he was one of the engineers that helped design it and then stayed on to help run it." And I said, "We're in staff meeting, and I noticed sometimes you tend to doze off," and he kind of chuckled. And then he said, "But then," I said, "what amazes me is no matter when what we ask you a question about, doesn't matter. Even though you seem to have been asleep, and you always have an answer." He says, "How do you do that?" He gave me a very short, one-sentence answer. He said, "Kent, you think this is the first time the subject has come up." So what he told me, and as I have gotten older, I have realized that there is really nothing new under the sun, just like they say in Ecclesiastes. We're just replaying it in a different situation or with different technology, but it's still the same situation. That's where age and wisdom comes in. And that's why we as the older folks need to tell the youth to help them to gain wisdom early. Because as both Proverbs tells us, and all through the Bible, but in Proverbs especially, and in Ecclesiastes, the one thing we should seek is wisdom. And when we quit seeking wisdom, then we can get into trouble. But even if we seek wisdom, and now let's get back to the lesson, that even though this king that we're talking about was born poor, and poor may not mean poverty when they say poor in the Old Testament. Poor could also mean you were of the common folk, that you were not in the aristocratic bloodline or leadership roles. And so even if you came from that common background, that you could, if you were, and with wisdom, you could rise to be the king, even if you'd been in prison. But even though you do all of this and rise with your wisdom and do great things, it said, I'm looking at my two versions here. It says that, but then everyone rushes to the side of yet another youth who replaces him. Endless crowds stand around him, but then another generation grows up and rejects him too. So it is all meaningless, like chasing the wind. And when somebody said, I forget who it was, one of you said something about even if you get to that point, people forget about you and so forth. And that's true. We remember some of the founding fathers. We remember at least Washington and Jefferson, or what we're taught about them, right? We remember about Sam Houston and what we've been taught about him. Right? But many of us don't know anything about Taft, and probably very few of us in here, if anyone, could probably name any of the vice presidents that served prior to the 1920s or maybe the teens. Don't know. Some of us know who Sam Rayburn is. He's the guy that the lake's named after. Other than that, we probably don't know much about Sam Rayburn and what he did in the Congress. There are a lot of folks that we don't, and these are all politicians. So it is true that even though we work to attain this high level of political influence, or some people might, what good is it? Because in a generation or two, they'll forget about you. Most of the kids now would not know who a Spiro Agnew is. Many of us do, and many of us probably, and probably most of the young people don't even know what Nixon did and didn't do. Dwight Eisenhower and so forth. It's just that once you reach a point, the generations, they take no notice of you. And so that's why he said, trying to achieve this level of political influence, it's futile. He's not saying don't go and do it. He's not saying don't work toward these things. And that's the one thing he says it's futile. It's not to keep you necessarily from doing that activity as much as it is for you to remember that in the end, it's futile. God's going to be in control. So, I don't know, maybe I'm paraphrasing. Don't take yourself too seriously. We've got people now that in our government that, they're trying their best to leave a legacy. And some of them are going to leave some legacy, that's for sure. But anyway, that's really what this was particular. So I said I was going to talk about politics. This was talking about political office, but it could be attributed to anything. I mean, any high position to which we aspire. Some of the people I most admire are those CEOs and people who do reach these high pinnacles of influence and control over corporations, but yet retain a sense of, well, they don't take themselves too seriously. And one of them was a gentleman by the name of Gordon Bethune. Now, anyone know who Gordon Bethune is or was? Gordon Bethune was for a long time the president and CEO of Continental Airlines, and I got to meet him and talk with him several times. And Bethune, unlike his successors that I worked with, was very much a hands-on person. He was not ostentatious and so forth. In fact, he would go out on the ramp there at Intercontinental Airport, just walk out on the ramp in work clothes and throw bags with his baggage people. He'd just get out and be grabbing bags and, putting them up. Or he'd do all the little jobs in the airline. And he was a pilot. I mean, so he even flew, but he didn't take himself so seriously or think about himself so haughtily that he wouldn't go out and do that. For that, I think we probably remember him better than the CEOs that came after him. One of the CEOs that came after him was about my age, a little younger, and acted so unwisely or with no wisdom that I once turned to my boss and said, I don't know whether to argue with him or spank him. So there's always those issues of youth and so forth. So we need to encourage our youth to obtain wisdom as soon as possible. But we need to always understand that in our lives, when we reach a certain pinnacle, don't take ourselves too seriously. Use wisdom to do things, but again, you will be forgotten. Any particular thoughts on that? Any experience? Yes, ma'am.
Popularity is something that is so fickle. I mean, and the popular people sometimes are the ones that say what they want, easy or whatever. And I'm thinking of preachers, I'm thinking about parents, etc. What is really the priority in that? Who do we follow? A popular person or do we follow God? And so you make a choice sometimes. They're not always going to say, right, God's will. And what's a popular person? It does say that it's wise, but maybe all that was really said, or it's just the one that
Right, you said he may have gone to his head and that he acted foolishly. But you're right about popularity. In our culture today, it seems that people equate popularity with wisdom. Yeah.
After it was time.
Uh-huh.
Whereas fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom.
Exactly.
Period. I mean, that's the start of it.
That's,
So it goes along with what you said. Not all ways are popular people.
exactly. That's a good segue into the next section. It is. About fear of the Lord being at the beginning of wisdom. Anything else? I mean, we have popular people today, and for some reason or the other, just because of our social media, they seem to have a lot more influence than they actually do. And it is very fickle. They can be just totally revered one week, and the next, all their fans have turned on them. So, you have to understand that if you're like that, the people that are supporting you or like you and the crowds, everyone gets around you, it's fleeting. So which is better? As to the whole thing, everything can come down to, it is better to have God and do like God says or follow God's lead than that of man. And we've heard all of that. And that's what we need to understand. So here's just another example of we need to follow God and his example. and do what God would do, even if it is unpopular, which today, unfortunately, a lot of what we espouse or what we say is what we believe is looked upon by others as a very unpopular, and but yet that should not stop us from doing that. But talking about the fear of the Lord being the beginning of wisdom, let's move on to chapter 5, starting in verse 1. All right. I'm going to start in verse 1. It says, "Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. Better to approach in obedience than to offer the sacrifice as fools do, for they ignorantly do wrong. Do not be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive to make a speech before God. God is in heaven, and you are on earth, so let your words be few. Just as dreams accompany much labor, so also a fool's voice comes with many words." We'll stop there. Guard your steps when you go to the house of God. That means be cautious as you go. That's what the word guard means, be cautious, to be on your guard when going into the house of God. And it says, better to approach in obedience than to offer the sacrifice as fools do, for they ignorantly do wrong. When you first read that, I don't know if it struck you a little bit as odd, but have something that says to be cautious when you go into the house of God. I go, that doesn't seem right. I mean, why should you? Because caution seems to indicate that you have a little fear, or you wouldn't be cautious when you go in just to a place. Why would you think the teacher here would say, be on your guard when you go into the house of God? Why would he say that? Any idea? What? Ma'am? Or sir? I say again?
It's more your mindset. You guard against your mind and be on, don't have your mind set on other things. Be cautious to go to. When you're coming into the Lord's house, you're going to praise God.
Excellent.
Keep your mind on things of the world or what's going on.
That's excellent, because you're right. Because what you're talking about a little bit is what is the key is in the second part where it says, better to approach in obedience. God wants us to come in as obedient servants to this house of worship. And there's nothing special about the materials here that we have constructed into a sanctuary. It is the ideal. It is the idea. It's what's inside. I don't know how many of you think this, but I think we are beginning to lose the fear of the Lord. Now, what do y'all think about that? What do you think about the fear of the Lord? Is that a good thing, bad thing?
I think it's good. I think there's a certain amount of fear that we have to have, and we can stay with it.
Mm-hmm. That there is a certain amount of fear that is good when we come in to see God. Anybody else agree? Or
If we think of fear as the awesomeness of God,
exactly.
when we come to worship, the reverence is important.
Mm-hmm. As you were growing up, did you fear your father? Okay, some say no. I see somebody shaking their head. Some say yes.
I fear not as a mean
Exactly. Now, some of us may have had no fear. What I'm trying to, the point you're trying to make here is our own fathers. I only feared him if I had done something wrong, but I also loved him, respected him, and would talk with him. So it wasn't like this cowering fear that every time he came home, I was, Now, I must admit there are some people that do that.
It's a reverent fear.
Yes.
You want to be worthy of his love.
Exactly. Worthy of his love, a reverent fear, a respectful fear, an awesomeness fear. Anyone have any other thoughts on that? Because this is important, is that it is, to the lesson.
I don't think that you really understand how wise your parents are until you get to be older and you realize everything that they ever wanted to teach you was to help. It was not to burden you. It was not to,
Mm-hmm.
And when you get older, you realize that, gosh, they were so smart.
Exactly. That they didn't mean it to harm you, they meant it to help you, but of course, as youth, being unwise, we didn't hear. The fear of the Lord, the reason I say that, and this is more personal opinion, and so that's why I would like to hear from some of you. I have been to congregations where you go in, and everyone's talking before the service and fellowshipping. And then I've been to services where the congregation, when they come into the sanctuary, they don't talk. They simply go to their seat and assume an attitude of prayer. I don't think there's anything wrong with either one. But I have seen congregations that when you go in, they have their cup of coffee or their Danish, and then they're talking, and then they mosey on in to the sanctuary with their coffee and Danish and sit down, and they want to convey that this is a casual atmosphere, that you should feel free to do whatever. And there's nothing, I don't think, wrong with that. It goes back to what is the condition of your heart. That is the key. However, we don't like to talk about it, and today's generations don't even want to mention it, but sometimes the things you do openly tend to give an indication of what you think inwardly. And so I'm from that old generation that if you came into the sanctuary and treating it more like it's a theater setting where you're taking in your coffee and your Danish and you want to sit down and you're waiting for the entertainment to begin, I don't think that, to me, shows that the condition of the heart is correct. But thank goodness, or no, not thank goodness, thank God that it is not my opinion that counts, but God's. And that's why he said, let me judge. But we need to think about, too, what's the example we're setting, because later on in the New Testament, Paul tells us that if you have become a stumbling block to a brother or sister, then that's on you. So there's so many things we have to take a look at. So when we come on, all he's saying here is obedience. And I think it was Isaiah or Elijah, I should have done my research a little better, that said, well, even Jesus said that God desires our obedience more than our sacrifices. That's what he wants. He wants the heart. And that may make why Christianity, or following God, the easy thing about our faith is probably the most difficult thing thing to grasp. God did not make a relationship with Him difficult. It's all you have to do is just give up your free will and to His and be saved. But you just have to do that. Most people go, wait a minute, it can't be that easy. I've got to do this. They feel like they've got to do something, whatever. But all I'm saying is that sometimes just the simple acts of obedience can be some of the most difficult things we do, and therefore sometimes, and then I'm reminded when Jesus said the easy I make difficult, or the whatever, and anyway. So anyway, this is part of it. Is what's that? Now this is interesting. Let's go on. Anybody have anything else? Because I'm kind of rambling a little bit, but I wanted you to get the gist of this about the fear of the Lord and guarding your steps as you came into His house. And remember to have that awesomeness of God. And because I think sometimes we trivialize God. And let's go on to this, and I'll continue that thought. Let me go on, beginning in 2 again. Do not be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive to make speech before God. God is in heaven, and you are on earth, so let your words be few. And later on, Jesus said, when you pray, don't babble like the Gentiles do, and oft repeating of words, and just go, oh Lord bless me, blah 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 blah. Think about it. Is there anything you can say to God that He doesn't already know? Is there something you know, or that you've discovered, or that you feel, or that has happened to you that God is unaware of? Is there? No. Do we all agree that there is absolutely nothing that you can bring to God or talk to God or do anything that God doesn't already know? No. Then why should we speak to God? And we'll get into that later. But here it says, do not be hasty to speak, and do not be impulsive to make a speech before God. In other words, God is our loving Father who really cares about us and does forgive us. But we also need to remember that awesomeness as well. And I don't think we should trivialize what we had talked to God about. And what trivialization is going to be different for everyone. What it is for me will be different probably for you. And that, again, is your own heart talking to God. By trivial, I mean, I'm trying to get a good example. It's just saying, oh Lord, please let this day, or please let lunch be good today. Or, and we can do different trivial. Oh Lord, please do this, which it may be something as simple as, oh Lord, help me find my favorite ink pen that I lost. I'm not going to say that's wrong, and that's between you and God. I don't know. Sometimes I think of things that, why am I bothering God with this? He knows, but, am I trivializing? Am I treating him like a magic genie? He's not a magic genie, and so I have to kind of think about it. So anyway, that's between you and God, and that's what this is talking about. Be careful in your speech when you're talking to God, because think how much higher He is than us. And yes, we are His creation, and yes, we are His children, and yes, He loves us, but He is still omnipotent, omnipresent God. So just that is what the lesson's about. That's between you and God as to what you think too few words or too many words are. Oh, down here it says, just as dreams accompany much labor, also a fool's voice becomes with many words. All that's just saying is that if you're speaking a lot or doing a lot of things, sometimes you can't sleep at night because your mind's all active. And rest is something from God, and it also wants to talk about the more words you speak, the more likely you are to be called a fool. What is it? What's the old adage? It is better to keep your mouth closed and be thought a fool than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. Okay. So even, sayings, it's just talking too much, like I'm doing right now, can make you seem like a fool, which maybe I'm getting close to that. So just be careful in what you do. There's nothing wrong with, not being as verbose as you need to be, especially when it comes to the house of God. When you make a vow to God, this is in verse 4, when you make a vow to God, don't delay fulfilling it, because He does not delight in fools. Fulfill what you vow. Better that you do not vow than you vow and not fulfill it. Do not let your mouth bring guilt on you, and do not say in the presence of the messenger that it was a mistake. Why should God be angry with your words and destroy the works of your hands? For many dreams bring futility, so do many words. Therefore, fear God. What's the story that comes to mind? Aenias and Sapphira. Remember that in Acts, where they said they would give the proceeds from the sale of the land to the church? What happened? They kept part of it back, didn't they? So when they went in, Ananias or whatever he was, they asked him, he lied. God struck him dead. His wife came in, same thing. That is an example that they made a vow to God and they didn't fulfill it. Nowhere that I am aware does God require us to make a vow to Him that I'm aware of. Now, we say obedience, and then you may consider that a vow, but we're not talking about that. We're talking more almost like a contract that you say, God, if you will do this, I will do this. Or, God, I promise to bring this to you, and you make a vow, have witnesses in church or something. Or you get up and you say that you're going to, you pledge to give so much to a particular organization or to the church or whatever. You've made a vow. So that's what he said. Be careful when you make these vows. God doesn't forget. And if you, basically, when you make a vow and you say you're going to do something and you don't do it, what is it called? You lied to God. Now, if I said don't lie to God, most of you can say, well, of course not. I never lie to God. That's part of the vow. I want to get on to something else which is not in the lesson and go over it real quickly because I thought it was interesting. Anything on the vow? All right, everybody pretty much clear on that one? This is not in the lesson, but I thought it very interesting, and this is the other political thing. Move on to chapter 5, verse 8. And even though this isn't a lesson, I read it and go, oh man, I've got to bring this out. I want to see what the group thinks about it. So here you go, starting in verse 8. If you see oppression of the poor and perversion of justice and righteousness in the province, don't be astonished at the situation, because one official protects another official, and higher officials protect them. The profit from the land is taken by all. The king is served by the field. Now, what does that mean? Well, let me read this in New Living Testament here. Don't be surprised if you see a poor person being oppressed by the powerful and if justice is being miscarried throughout the land. For every official is under orders from higher up, and matters of justice get lost in red tape and bureaucracy. Even the king milks the land for his own profit. I thought it would be interesting and to discuss in the few minutes we have left that what he's saying is basically officials are corrupt. Government is corrupt. And I got to thinking about it and going, to certain extents, yeah, they are. Some governments are more corrupt than others, and some of them are open about it, and some of them really try to hide it very, very well. And so, what is the teacher trying to tell us here? Is he trying to tell us, and I hope I don't offend anyone, is he trying to tell us that we should or shouldn't buy Hunter Biden's art for $500,000 apiece? There are some in the media that say this is just another kind of corrupt use of name and person and so forth. Okay. Corruption. There are other pundits in there that say they're putting mask mandates on certain people, but yet when the situation applies to them, they don't wear masks. Now, is that corruption? It might be. It's where if you don't follow the rules that you lay down for others. A lot of times when we think about corruption, we think about profiting from the public or from the taxes that you're entrusted to make use of. And yes, I'm sure there is out there, and I have seen some of it firsthand. It wasn't the overt kind, but within the system, they were using the system to basically put profit for somebody else. There was a particular contractor that was a political supporter of one of the city council members in Houston. And my boss came to me and said, you need to add this contractor to the contract that we're about to execute. And we just gone through a selection process, and we had them all named. And I said, I don't need them. He said, well, council member so-and-so asked, he called and said that this was a good person and really would like to see them on, they'd like to see them get some work. Well, in the political world, that means this person is a supporter of mine or somehow related to me, and I want you to put them on this contract, or the next time you come to city council needing something, you won't have my vote. I'll just vote no. I don't care if you come to sit here and say you're going to give $10 million to orphans. I'm still going to vote no when you're on that. So that's what happened. So that was a form of corruption that I knew was going on, but, very little I could do about it because my boss said go ahead and do it. And I had to restrain myself and said, wait a minute, maybe this is not that person's fault, because also, and this is corrupt in a way, I would have been corrupt if I had said, okay, put them on the team. I'll make sure they don't get one red cent out of the contract. I would manipulate the work so that they got nothing, no gain from their political influence. So there is corruption there. But, and you would think, well, if it's so corrupt, government, and it wasn't that the teacher was trying to tell us the government is bad. He's just going to say there's going to be corruption. It's there. Because one official is going to cover another official, or you're going to hide something down here and this one won't find it, or if this one does something, and it just goes on up the line and it's a big cover-up and all this kind of stuff. And yes, that does happen. But what he's trying to get across here is that government is needed, and that we should understand that we can't have anarchy where everybody just runs amok. We've got to have government, and so even though there is corruption, we need it. Because in the end, and he says, the profit from the land is taken by all, and the king is served by the field. All he's trying to say is that government's going to do what's good in the best interest of the general economy and everyone, because, yes, they may slice stuff off of taxes or put taxes where they don't need to be, but they still need the taxes, and the only way to get the taxes is to make sure that what produces the taxes is protected, which means government is what gives us roads, gives us sanitary sewer systems, gives us power grids that sometimes work, and other things. So we just need to understand that this is life, and how do we deal with it? So, and in today we hear a lot about all this, but I will tell you, corruption is in the public sector is getting very, very difficult. Every year, all state employees with Texas, for example, have to go through an ethics course that's about 2 or 3 hours long. Every year, goes through everything. And since I worked for the city of Houston a great many years ago, I would accept somebody would come along and I'd be at a conference and they said, "You want to go to dinner?" And I said, "Sure." So they would take us out to dinner. Kathy and I would go with some consultant that had worked with us or something. Now it has got to the point where, and this is probably good, it's a little bit of, I think, the pendulum swinging the wrong way, but now you can't accept anything from anybody, even if it's a friend of yours that says, "Hey, we're here, why don't you go to dinner with us?" I can't accept it. Even if I go to a place where I attend a luncheon and I'm sitting at a table of that somebody sponsored, I have to pay for my own meal, even though I was invited to sit at that table. And that's good. It kind of keeps things under. And if we received any kind of gift, I can't, somebody will, at Christmas, people used to send out fruit baskets and so forth to us. And we can't accept those now, or anything for Christmas or anything. So there are lots of things in place in in the public sector to keep corruption down. I've often joked that the only difference between the public and the private sector is the private sector, when I work for them, they said, "We hired you to do a job, and as long as you do the job and make a profit, we trust you, and we hired you because we think you're trustworthy." When I get hired by the public sector and I've worked for them, it's like, "You're a crook. Here's all the rules you've got to follow." And I feel like, oh man, so it's kind of interesting because there is that. Any thoughts on that, on government? Again, it's back to politics, but government we need, but there may be corruption. Any thoughts on that? Everybody agrees? My wife just looked at her watch and says, "Ken, it's time to stop. We've got this mental telepathy."
In those meetings that you have to go, are you told what you're to believe?
To believe about what?
Anything. Are you told how to think and how to believe about any certain things?
No. We're never taught anything about belief. Everything is in the law, and we're to follow the law. And so far in my public life, as in there, and even in the private sector, I have never been in had a lesson or training that's ever come in conflict with my Christian belief. Exactly. Now, there are some issues with equity, which you're all hearing that word bound. But up until this point, they say we are to recognize gay couples. Can't discriminate against them. Actually, nothing has come in conflict with my Christian life just because they're gay, God says we're to reach out to everyone. And so I don't have to accept them, but should I treat them but then I shouldn't treat them hatefully. And so far, even though that's about as close as it's come to testing my Christian faith, is how to deal with those in that situation. So no, I don't know, but no, there's been nothing, and I've been very fortunate so far in my career, both in the public and private sectors, that nothing has come up that officially in what I was taught that was, or told to do, that was, Oh, well, they'd like me to think that, but, and the reason I'm for that is, this kind of gets off the subject, but I guess it's something that is important. And this is all personal opinion. It has nothing to do. In fact, if you'd like to go into the bathroom or go get a drink of water, go ahead. A person with whom I want to associate, it has nothing to do with color, background, or anything. I'm finding that the people that I want to associate with have the same set of values in the spirit that I have. And that is neutral in the way it comes to color or anything. And so that's how I treat people all the time. So yeah, I don't know if many of you think about this, but no, I've had nothing that ever says that. And that's a whole nother story. I'd love to get into it, but we need to probably break. But if anything, I'll just leave with this. It's values, not color, skin color and origin. It's values. Christian brothers and sisters come in all shapes, sizes, colors, origins, whatever. So that's what we should be more involved. We shouldn't be thinking in terms of racism and all that. We should be thinking lost and unlost. That's really the only differentiation we should make. Anything from anybody? I've kept you a little long. Sorry about that. And I apologize for that. But thank you for your attention. Thank you for your participation. And class dismissed.